Attention! Prepare yourself for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in the history of rural New Hampshire. Before we begin, I ask that you write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. In the autumn of 1953, a small advertisement appeared in the Grafton County Gazette, a weekly newspaper that circulated among the scattered farms and villages of northern New Hampshire. The advertisement was modest, occupying less than a quarter page, and it requested volunteers for what it described as a scientific study on consciousness and memory. The pay was described as generous for the time, $20 per session, and participants were required to commit to at least 6 weekly visits. The advertisement provided an address on Route 47, approximately 9 miles north of the town of Warren, and requested that interested parties write to Dr. Alden Pierce for further information. What made this advertisement peculiar, according to those who remembered it decades later, was not the request itself, but the line that appeared at the bottom in smaller print. It read, "Participants must be willing to explore the boundary between waking and permanent rest." Several residents who saw the advertisement later told local historians that they found the phrasing unsettling, though none could articulate exactly why. The words seemed carefully chosen to avoid saying something directly, as if the true nature of the study was being deliberately obscured. Within 2 weeks of the advertisement's publication, Dr. Pierce had received 17 letters of inquiry. By the end of October, he had selected 5 participants. None of them would speak publicly about what occurred during those sessions for more than a decade, and when they finally did, their accounts were fragmented, contradictory, and marked by long pauses and visible distress. Dr. Alden Pierce was not unknown in the academic community, though his reputation had become complicated by the early 1950s. Born in 1907 in Providence, Rhode Island, Pierce had completed his doctorate in experimental psychology at Yale University in 1933. His early work focused on memory consolidation and the physiological markers of consciousness, and he published several well-regarded papers in respected journals during the 1930s and early 40s. Colleagues from that period described him as meticulous, intellectually ambitious, and somewhat aloof. He married in 1936, though his wife Margaret rarely appeared in photographs or at academic functions. They had no children, a fact that Pierce never discussed publicly. In 1947, Pierce abruptly resigned from his position at Dartmouth College, where he had been teaching since 1941. The college administration provided no official reason for his departure, and Pierce himself offered no public explanation. He purchased a property on Route 47 shortly thereafter, a large farmhouse set back from the road and surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor lived more than a mile away. Pierce was seen occasionally in Warren, purchasing supplies or visiting the post office, but he engaged in minimal conversation and discouraged questions about his work. A clerk at the general store later recalled that Pierce once mentioned he was conducting private research, but when asked about the nature of this research, he smiled slightly and said only that he was exploring questions that institutions were not prepared to examine seriously. The farmhouse where Pierce conducted his study still stands, though it has been abandoned since the early 1970s. Photographs taken by county assessors in 1968 show a 2-story wooden structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The windows on the 2nd floor were covered from the inside with what appeared to be dark fabric or paper. The property included a detached barn, which Pierce converted into what he referred to in his notes as the observation room. According to documents discovered years later, the barn's interior had been stripped of its original function and reconfigured into a space dominated by a single examination table surrounded by monitoring equipment. Pierce had acquired electroencephalography machines, blood pressure monitors, and other instruments through private suppliers, paying in cash and providing minimal information about their intended use. He kept detailed records of every modification made to the space, including the installation of soundproofing material on the interior walls and the addition of locks on both sides of the barn door. When questioned about this years later, one of the equipment suppliers remembered Pierce as calm and articulate, but noted that he insisted on having the equipment delivered to a location several miles from his actual property, where he retrieved it himself using a covered truck. The 5 individuals who responded to Pierce's advertisement and were selected for participation ranged in age from 28 to 54. All were residents of Grafton County. All were experiencing some form of financial difficulty, which likely influenced their willingness to participate, despite the unsettling nature of the advertisement. Their names were eventually documented through cross-referencing property records, tax documents, and later testimonies, though for years their identities remained unknown to anyone outside of Pierce's private records. The first participant was Thomas Hewitt, a 32-year-old carpenter whose wife had died in childbirth the previous year. The second was Eleanor Finch, a 41-year-old schoolteacher who lived alone and was known in Warren as quiet and intensely private. The third was Robert Marsh, a 54-year-old farmer who had recently lost a significant portion of his land to debt. The fourth was Catherine Lyle, a 28-year-old widow whose husband had been killed in a logging accident in 1951. The fifth was Daniel Croft, a 47-year-old former mill worker who had been unemployed for more than a year. What these individuals shared beyond their need for money was a certain kind of isolation. None had extensive family networks. None were deeply embedded in the social life of their communities. None, it seemed, would be immediately missed if they withdrew from public view for a period of weeks. The sessions began in early November of 1953. According to Pierce's records, each participant was scheduled to arrive at the farmhouse on a specific afternoon, always alone, and always with instructions to tell no one the precise location of their visits. Pierce provided detailed directions in his initial correspondence, but he also included a request that participants avoid discussing the study with others, framing this as necessary to preserve the integrity of the research. The first session for each participant followed an identical structure. Pierce would meet them at the farmhouse, offer them coffee or tea, and conduct what he described as an intake interview. This interview lasted approximately 2 hours and covered the participants' medical history, sleep patterns, recurring dreams, memories of deceased relatives, and their beliefs about consciousness and death. Pierce recorded these interviews using a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and fragments of these recordings were later found in a storage unit in Concord, New Hampshire, in 1976. The recordings reveal Pierce's voice as calm and steady, asking questions in a neutral tone, rarely interrupting. The participants' voices, by contrast, often sound hesitant, uncertain, as if they were trying to determine what answers Pierce wanted to hear. After the intake interview, Pierce would lead the participant to the barn. He would explain that the next phase of the study involved monitoring their physiological responses during a state of deep relaxation. He would ask them to lie on the examination table. He would attach electrodes to their scalp, chest, and wrists. He would lower the lights, and then, according to later accounts, he would begin speaking in a low, rhythmic voice, guiding them through what he described as a descent into the boundary state. What Pierce meant by the boundary state was never fully articulated in his surviving notes, but the fragments that remain suggest he believed there existed a specific physiological and psychological condition in which a person could approach the threshold of death without crossing it entirely. He theorized that in this state, consciousness would begin to detach from the body, allowing for the observation and measurement of what he referred to as the persistent self. His hypothesis, as far as it can be reconstructed, was that if consciousness could be separated from physical processes, even temporarily, it would provide evidence that the self continued in some form beyond biological death. To achieve this state, Peirce employed a combination of guided visualization, controlled breathing, and what he described in his notes as pharmacological assistance. The exact substances he used were never definitively identified, though references in his correspondence suggest he had obtained barbiturates and possibly other sedatives through questionable channels. Participants later described feeling a profound sense of heaviness during the sessions, as if their bodies were sinking into the table, followed by a sensation of floating or drifting. Some reported vivid hallucinations. Others described a feeling of being watched, not by Peirce, but by something else, something they could not see but could sense in the darkness of the barn. Peirce would remain in the room throughout, monitoring the equipment, taking notes, occasionally speaking to the participant in that same low, steady voice. The sessions lasted between 3 and 5 hours. When they ended, participants often found it difficult to stand. Several reported lingering disorientation that lasted for days. By late November, all 5 participants had completed their 3rd session. It was at this point that the nature of the study began to shift in ways the participants had not anticipated. Peirce introduced what he called the correspondence protocol. He explained that he wanted participants to begin documenting their experiences outside of the sessions, particularly their dreams, any unusual sensations, and what he referred to as intrusive cognitions, thoughts, or memories that seemed to arrive without conscious origin. He provided each participant with a journal and explicit instructions on how to structure their entries. The journals were to be brought to each session and reviewed by Peirce, who would ask detailed questions about specific entries. Participants were also instructed to note any encounters with deceased individuals in their dreams, any sense of presence when alone, and any moments in which they felt as though they were observing themselves from outside their own bodies. What troubled several of the participants, according to their later accounts, was not the request itself, but the way Peirce responded to their entries. He seemed particularly interested in dreams involving the dead, and he would press for details with an intensity that felt disproportionate. He wanted to know what the deceased individuals had said, what they had looked like, whether they had appeared as they did in life or somehow altered. One participant, Eleanor Finch, later recalled that Peirce became visibly agitated during one session when she described a dream in which her deceased mother had appeared standing at the foot of her bed, silent and watching. Peirce asked her to repeat the description 3 times, recording it each time, and then asked whether she believed the figure in the dream had actually been her mother, or merely a representation constructed by her subconscious. When Finch said she did not know, Peirce leaned forward and said, in a voice she described as almost eager, "But it felt like her, did it not? It felt like the actual presence of the person, not simply a memory." Read, the 4th session for each participant introduced a new and unsettling element. Peirce informed them that he would be attempting what he called guided separation. He explained that he believed it was possible, under the right conditions, to facilitate a temporary detachment of consciousness from the body, allowing the participant to observe their own physical form from a removed perspective. He framed this as a critical component of his research, the moment when they would approach the boundary state most closely. He acknowledged that the process might be disorienting, but assured them that he would monitor their vital signs continuously and that they would be returned to full consciousness without harm. What he did not tell them, and what only became clear years later, was that he had begun administering significantly higher doses of sedatives during these sessions. Participants described the experience of the 4th session as fundamentally different from the previous 3. The sense of heaviness was more profound. The hallucinations were more vivid and more disturbing. Several reported a sensation of rising above the table, of looking down and seeing their own bodies below, inert and pale in the dim light. Others described a feeling of being pulled backward, as if being drawn away from the barn, away from the farmhouse, into a vast and empty darkness. Thomas Hewitt later told a researcher that during his fourth session, he became convinced he had died. He could not move, he could not speak. He could hear Pierce's voice in the distance, but it sounded muffled and distorted, as if coming from underwater. He saw his own body on the table, and he saw Pierce standing beside it, writing in a notebook, entirely unconcerned. Hewitt tried to call out, to signal that something was wrong, but his voice produced no sound. The session, according to Pierce's records, lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes. When Hewitt finally regained full consciousness, he was shaking and drenched in sweat. Pierce helped him sit up, offered him water, and asked him to describe what he had experienced. When Hewitt said he thought he had died, Pierce wrote this down and then asked, "And where did you go?" By December of 1953, the participants had begun to change in ways that were noticeable to those who knew them. Thomas Hewitt stopped attending church services, something he had done every Sunday since his wife's death. Eleanor Finch missed several days of work at the school, citing illness, though when she did appear, colleagues later recalled that she seemed distracted and distant, staring out the window during her classes, as if listening for something. Robert Marsh, the farmer, began sleeping in his barn rather than his house, telling a neighbor that he could not tolerate the silence of the empty rooms. Catherine Lyle was seen walking along Route 47 late at night, sometimes past midnight, always alone, always moving slowly as if in a trance. Daniel Croft, the former mill worker, stopped leaving his small rented room entirely, and his landlord later reported that he could hear Croft talking to himself at all hours, long rambling monologues that seemed to be addressed to someone who was not there. None of them discussed the sessions with others, adhering to Pierce's request for confidentiality, but their behavior suggested that something profound and destabilizing was occurring. The fifth session, scheduled for mid-December, was the last that all 5 participants completed. What happened during these sessions remains unclear, as Pierce's notes become fragmented and difficult to interpret at this point in his records. There are references to successful separations, to confirmed observations, to data that exceeded expectations, but there are also references to complications, to adverse reactions, to moments when participants had to be physically restrained. One entry, dated December 18, 1953, reads simply, "Subject 3 unresponsive for 11 minutes. Revival required manual intervention." Upon regaining consciousness, subject reported seeing the room from the ceiling and described objects on the upper shelf that should not have been visible from table position. Description accurate. Implications require further examination. The sixth session, scheduled for late December, did not proceed as planned. On December 22nd, Thomas Hewitt failed to arrive at the farmhouse for his appointment. Pierce waited for 3 hours, according to a notation in his daily log, and then drove to Hewitt's residence, a small cabin approximately 6 miles from Warren. The cabin was empty. Hewitt's truck was parked outside, the keys still in the ignition. The door was unlocked. Inside, the table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. A cup of coffee sat on the counter, long since gone cold. Pierce returned to the cabin twice over the following days, but Hewitt did not reappear. A missing person report was filed on December 27th by a relative in Vermont who had expected Hewitt for Christmas. Local authorities conducted a brief search of the surrounding woods but found no sign of him. The investigation was eventually closed due to lack of evidence, and Hewitt was presumed to have left the area voluntarily, possibly due to emotional distress related to his wife's death. His disappearance was noted in the Grafton County Gazette on January 5, 1954, in a short article that mentioned his recent widowhood and suggested he may have been struggling with grief. The article made no mention of Dr. Pierce or the study. Eleanor Finch completed her 6th session on December 23rd. According to Pierce's notes, the session lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes, significantly longer than any previous session. Finch did not return for a 7th session. She resigned from her teaching position in early January, providing no explanation to the school administration, and moved out of her apartment in Warren. Her whereabouts for the next several years are unknown. She reappeared in New Hampshire in 1961, living in a boarding house in Manchester, but she refused to discuss the period between 1954 and 1961 with anyone, including a journalist who attempted to interview her in 1968. The journalist later described Finch as profoundly damaged, a woman who seemed to exist in a state of constant low-level fear, looking over her shoulder frequently and speaking in a near whisper even when there was no need for quiet. Robert Marsh, Catherine Lyle, and Daniel Croft all completed their 6th sessions in the final days of December. None of them returned for a 7th. Marsh was found dead in his barn on January 7, 1954. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though he was only 54 years old and had no known history of cardiac problems. His body was discovered by a neighbor who had become concerned after noticing that Marsh's livestock had not been fed for several days. The neighbor later told the county sheriff that the barn had been unusually cold, even for January, and that Marsh's body had been positioned in a way that seemed deliberate, lying flat on his back, with his arms at his sides and his eyes open. The neighbor also mentioned, though this detail was not included in the official report, that there were marks on the dirt floor surrounding Marsh's body, faint impressions that looked like words or symbols, though they were too smudged to be legible. Catherine Lyle left New Hampshire in mid-January and moved to Boston, where she found work as a seamstress. She lived there for 3 years before dying in 1957 in what was ruled an accidental overdose of sleeping medication. A friend who had known her in Boston later told a researcher that Lyle had spoken occasionally about a period in her life when she had participated in a study that had gone wrong, but she never provided details. The friend also mentioned that Lyle had been terrified of falling asleep and would often stay awake for days at a time, dosing herself with coffee and no-dose tablets until exhaustion forced her to rest. Daniel Croft remained in his rented room in Warren until March of 1954, at which point his landlord evicted him for failure to pay rent. Croft was last seen walking north on Route 47, carrying a single bag of belongings. He was never reported missing because he had no family and few acquaintances. His name appears in no subsequent records. Dr. Alden Pierce continued his work at the farmhouse through the winter and spring of 1954, though he conducted no further sessions with human participants. His correspondence from this period, fragments of which were later recovered, suggests that he was preoccupied with analyzing the data he had collected and refining his theoretical framework. In a letter to a former colleague at Yale, dated March 19, 1954, Pierce wrote, "The evidence is incontrovertible, though I am aware it will be met with resistance. The boundary is not a metaphor, it is a physical location, or perhaps more accurately, a state that can be physically accessed. The subjects who approached it most closely reported a consistency of experience that cannot be dismissed as mere hallucination. They saw themselves, they saw the room. They saw details that should have been impossible to observe from their physical position, and several reported encounters with entities that were not present in any material sense, but that demonstrated knowledge and intentionality. I am convinced now that what we call death is not an ending, but a transition, And that consciousness persists in a form that remains tethered, at least initially, to the location of the body. The implications for our understanding of identity, memory, and the nature of existence itself are profound. The colleague, whose name was redacted in the copies of the letter that were eventually archived, apparently did not respond. There is no evidence that Pierce attempted to publish his findings in any academic journal. He remained at the farmhouse, increasingly isolated, rarely appearing in Warren, and communicating with the outside world only through occasional letters and supply orders. In June of 1954, Pierce's wife, Margaret, who had been living separately in Providence since 1948, filed for divorce. The court documents cited abandonment and estrangement, noting that Pierce had not visited her or provided financial support in more than a year. Margaret made no public statements about her husband's work or the reasons for their separation, and she died in 1962 without ever having spoken to researchers or journalists about her marriage. The divorce was finalized in October of 1954. Pierce did not contest it and did not appear at the hearing. By late 1954, Pierce's financial situation had become precarious. He had spent a significant portion of his savings on equipment, property modifications, and payments to the study participants. He applied for research grants from several foundations, submitting proposals that outlined his work on consciousness and the boundary state, but all of his applications were rejected. One foundation director later recalled that Pierce's proposal had been brilliant in its ambition, but deeply troubling in its methodology, particularly the sections that described the use of sedatives and the extended duration of the sessions. The director recommended that Pierce seek institutional oversight and ethical review, but there is no evidence that Pierce followed this advice. Instead, he appears to have grown increasingly isolated and possibly delusional. A journal entry from November of 1954, discovered among his papers, reads, "They do not understand because they have not crossed. They theorize and debate, but they have never felt the pull, never stood at the edge, and looked into the vastness beyond. I have brought 5 souls to the boundary, and 3 of them have shown me that the crossing is not only possible, but inevitable. The others were not lost. They went ahead. They are there now, waiting, watching, trying to communicate. I hear them some nights, faint voices coming from the barn, though I know the barn is empty. I have checked. I have stood in the center of the room and called out to them, and sometimes, in the silence that follows, I hear a response, not words exactly, but a presence, an acknowledgement. They know I am still here, and they are trying to tell me something." In February of 1955, a fire broke out in the barn on Pierce's property. The local volunteer fire department responded, but by the time they arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. The fire was extinguished before it could spread to the farmhouse, but the barn was completely destroyed. The fire marshal's investigation concluded that the cause was likely electrical, the result of outdated wiring and the high power demands of Pierce's equipment. Pierce was not present at the property when the fire occurred. He had been in Concord, meeting with a lawyer to discuss his financial difficulties. When he returned and saw the destroyed barn, witnesses later recalled he did not react with shock or distress. He stood in front of the smoldering remains for several minutes, staring at the ruins, and then walked back to the farmhouse without speaking. A firefighter, who had remained to ensure the fire was fully extinguished, later told a reporter that Pierce had seemed almost relieved, as if the destruction of the barn had resolved some internal conflict. Over the following months, Pierce made no effort to rebuild or repair the barn. He stopped ordering supplies, he stopped corresponding with colleagues. He was seen in Warren only twice, both times purchasing basic groceries, and on both occasions those who encountered him later described him as gaunt, unkempt, and distant, as if he were physically present but mentally elsewhere. In August of 1955, a real estate agent received an inquiry from Pierce about selling the farmhouse. The property was listed in September and sold in November to a family from Massachusetts who had no knowledge of what had occurred there. Pierce used the proceeds from the sale to settle his debts and then disappeared from public record. There is no death certificate for Alden Pierce in New Hampshire or Rhode Island. There is no record of him living under his own name anywhere in the United States after 1955. Researchers who later attempted to trace his whereabouts found fragmentary evidence suggesting he may have traveled to Europe, possibly to Switzerland or Austria, where he may have continued his work under a different name, but none of this has been confirmed. The farmhouse remained occupied by the Massachusetts family until 1963, when they sold it and moved back to their home state. In interviews conducted years later, the mother of the family mentioned that they had never felt comfortable in the house, particularly during the winter months. She described a persistent feeling of being watched, especially in the rooms on the second floor, and she noted that their children, who had been excited about the move initially, became withdrawn and anxious after the first few months. The father mentioned that he had found journals hidden in the attic, leather-bound books filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, but he had discarded them, assuming they were of no importance. The property changed hands 3 more times between 1963 and 1970, and each subsequent owner reported similar experiences: unexplained sounds, a sense of unease, dreams that were vivid and disturbing. In 1970, the property was abandoned after the most recent owner, an elderly man who had hoped to retire there, was found wandering Route 47 in the middle of the night, disoriented and unable to explain how he had ended up on the road. He told the county sheriff that he had been inside the house, asleep in his bed, and then suddenly he was outside, standing on the road with no memory of leaving. He refused to return to the property and forfeited his deposit to the real estate agent. The house has remained empty since then. It is still standing, slowly decaying, the windows shattered, the roof sagging, the surrounding forest gradually reclaiming the land. In 1976, a graduate student in the history of science at the University of New Hampshire came across a reference to Dr. Alden Pierce in a collection of archived correspondence at the Dartmouth College Library. The reference was brief, a mention in a letter from one professor to another discussing Pierce's abrupt departure in 1947, and it included a suggestion that Pierce had been experimenting with methods that the college administration found ethically dubious. Intrigued, the graduate student began researching Pierce's career and eventually discovered the advertisement in the Grafton County Gazette from 1953. This led to further investigation, including interviews with surviving residents of Warren, who remembered Pierce and the participants in his study. Over the course of 2 years, the graduate student pieced together much of what is now known about Pierce's work, including the identities of the 5 participants, the structure of the sessions, and the eventual fates of those involved. The graduate student also located a storage unit in Concord that had been rented by Pierce in 1954 and abandoned when he stopped making payments in 1955. The unit's contents had been seized by the storage facility and held in a warehouse, unclaimed and forgotten. Among the items were the reel-to-reel recordings of the intake interviews, several boxes of handwritten notes, diagrams of the barn's interior, and the journals that Pierce had asked the participants to keep. The graduate student attempted to publish a comprehensive account of Pierce's study in 1978, but the article was rejected by multiple journals, with reviewers expressing concern about the ethical implications of giving attention to research that had been conducted without oversight and had arguably caused harm. The student eventually published a condensed version in a small regional history journal, but it attracted little attention. The full archive of Pierce's materials was donated to the University of New Hampshire Library, where it remains in a restricted collection, accessible only to researchers who provide justification for their interest. Eleanor Finch, the only surviving participant who could be located as of the late 1970s, agreed to a single interview in 1979, shortly before her death. The interview was conducted by the same graduate student who had uncovered Pierce's story, and a transcript was included in the archived materials. Finch was 71 years old at the time, living in a nursing facility in Concord and suffering from advanced emphysema. She was reluctant to discuss the sessions in detail, stating that she had spent decades trying to forget what had happened and that revisiting it caused her significant distress. When pressed, however, she provided a fragmented account that included several disturbing details. She confirmed that Pierce had used sedatives during the sessions, though she did not know what substances he had administered. She described the sensation of separation, of rising above her body and observing herself from a distance, and she said that the experience had been both terrifying and strangely peaceful. She also mentioned, though she became visibly agitated when discussing this, that during her sixth and final session she had seen others in the barn, figures that had not been there when she entered. She described them as standing in the corners of the room, silent and motionless, watching her and Pierce. She said she had tried to tell Pierce what she was seeing, but her voice had not worked, and when she finally regained full consciousness and mentioned the figures, Pierce had become very excited and had asked her to describe them in as much detail as possible. She said that he seemed pleased, as if she had confirmed something he had been hoping to observe. When asked whether she believed the figures had been real or hallucinations, Finch paused for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, "I do not know what real means anymore. I saw them, I felt them watching, and when I left that barn for the last time I had the very strong feeling that they were still there, that they would always be there, waiting." She refused to answer any further questions and asked the interviewer to leave. She died 3 weeks later. The question of what Dr. Alden Pierce actually proved, if anything, remains unresolved. His research was never peer-reviewed. His methods would be considered grossly unethical by any contemporary standard. The data he collected, even if taken at face value, is anecdotal and unverifiable. And yet the consistency of the participants' accounts, the detailed descriptions of phenomena that align with out-of-body experiences reported in other contexts, and the documented physical changes observed by those who knew the participants, suggest that something profound occurred during those sessions in the barn on Route 47. Whether that something was evidence of consciousness persisting beyond death, as Pierce believed, or simply the result of powerful sedatives, and suggestion, as skeptics would argue, cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is that Pierce's work left lasting damage on those who participated, and that the consequences of his obsession extended far beyond the controlled environment of his study. Thomas Hewitt was never found. Robert Marsh died under circumstances that remain unexplained. Catherine Lyle and Eleanor Finch lived the remainder of their lives in states of profound psychological distress. Daniel Croft vanished entirely from the historical record, and Dr. Alden Pierce himself, the man who claimed to have opened a door to the boundary between life and death, disappeared into obscurity, leaving behind only fragments of notes, a burned barn, and a legacy of unanswered questions. The farmhouse on Route 47, as of the time of this account, has not been demolished. It stands empty, visible from the road, surrounded by overgrown fields and encroaching forest. Local teenagers occasionally dare each other to approach it, though few are willing to go inside. Those who have entered report a profound sense of wrongness, a feeling that intensifies the deeper one goes into the house. The second floor, where Pierce is believed to have kept his private journals and correspondence, remains largely intact, though the floorboards are rotting and the walls are stained with water damage and mold. In the room that appears to have been his study, there is a desk positioned near the window, and on that desk, according to those who have seen it, there is a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. The paper contains a handwritten note, undated, in what researchers believe to be Pierce's handwriting. The note reads, "They are not gone. They are here. They have always been here. And when the time comes, I will join them on the other side of the boundary, and we will continue the work together." Below this, in smaller, shakier script, is a final line. "The door is open. It will not close." In the decades since Pierce's disappearance, there have been occasional reports from residents of Warren and the surrounding area of unusual phenomena associated with the farmhouse and the land where the barn once stood. These reports are sporadic and often dismissed as folklore or the product of suggestion, but they are persistent enough to have entered the local oral history. People driving along Route 47 late at night claim to have seen lights in the upper windows of the farmhouse, though there is no electricity connected to the property. Others describe hearing voices, faint and indistinct, coming from the direction of the farmhouse when they pass by on foot. A hunter who was tracking deer through the woods behind the property in 1982 told the county sheriff that he had found a clearing where the barn had once stood, and that standing in the center of that clearing he had felt an overwhelming compulsion to lie down, as if something were pressing him toward the ground. He resisted the compulsion and left the area quickly. But he said the feeling had stayed with him for days afterward, a lingering sense that he had been in the presence of something that should not exist. These accounts, whether credible or not, have contributed to the farmhouse's reputation as a place to be avoided, and it is now widely regarded as haunted, though the nature of what might haunt it remains a matter of speculation and fear. The broader question raised by Dr. Pierce's work, the question of whether consciousness can exist independently of the body and whether it persists after death, remains one of the most contested and elusive questions in both science and philosophy. Modern neuroscience has made significant advances in understanding the biological basis of consciousness, mapping the neural correlates of awareness and exploring the ways in which brain activity gives rise to subjective experience. And yet, despite these advances, the fundamental nature of consciousness, its relationship to physical matter, and the possibility of its continuation beyond biological death remain deeply mysterious. Pierce believed he had found a way to investigate this mystery empirically, by bringing individuals to the threshold of death and observing what occurred at that boundary. His methods were reckless and his conclusions were speculative, but his fundamental question, whether the self persists when the body ceases to function, is one that humanity has grappled with since the emergence of self-awareness. What makes Pierce's story particularly disturbing is not the question he asked, but the price paid by those who helped him attempt to answer it. They volunteered in good faith, seeking money and perhaps meaning, and they were subjected to experiences that fundamentally altered their relationship to reality, to their own bodies, and to the prospect of death itself. Whatever Pierce discovered or believed he discovered in that barn, it came at an immense human cost, and whether his claims had any validity became, in the end, irrelevant compared to the suffering he caused. There is one final document in the archive at the University of New Hampshire that deserves mention, though its authenticity and significance remain subjects of debate among the few researchers who have examined it. The document is a letter, undated and unsigned, found tucked inside one of Pierce's journals. The handwriting does not match Pierce's, and forensic analysis conducted in the 1980s suggested the letter was written sometime in the mid to late 1950s, possibly several years after Pierce's disappearance. The letter is addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to anyone who might eventually find it. and it reads as follows. If you are reading this, you have found what remains of Dr. Pierce's work. I'm writing to tell you that he was correct, not in every detail and not in his methods, but in his central insight. The boundary is real. It can be approached, and those who approach it closely enough do not return unchanged. I know this because I was there. I was one of the 5. I will not tell you which one, because it does not matter. What matters is that I need you to understand that what Pierce created in that barn was not an experiment. It was a doorway. And once a doorway is opened, it does not close simply because you walk away from it. I can still feel it years later. I can feel the pull. I can hear the voices, faint but persistent, calling me back. I dream of the barn almost every night, and in those dreams I'm lying on the table, and Pierce is standing over me, and he is saying, "You are so close now, just a little further, just let go." And part of me wants to let go. Part of me wants to cross completely and see what is on the other side. But I am afraid, not of death itself, but of what I saw when I came close to it, the figures in the corners, the vast empty space beyond. The sense that consciousness does not end, but continues in a form that is alone, isolated, untethered, drifting forever in a darkness that has no boundaries and no light. If that is what awaits us, then perhaps it is better not to know. Perhaps Pierce should have left the question unanswered, but he did not. He opened the door, and now some of us are trapped between 2 worlds, unable to fully inhabit either, waiting for the moment when the pull becomes too strong to resist. The letter ends there, with no signature and no indication of who wrote it or when. Some researchers have suggested it was written by Eleanor Finch, based on certain phrasings that appear in her interview transcript, but this has never been confirmed. Others believe it may have been written by one of the participants who disappeared, Thomas Hewitt or Daniel Croft, and that it was placed in Pierce's journal by someone who discovered it after their death. A third theory, less widely accepted, is that the letter was written by Pierce himself as a form of confession or warning, using an altered handwriting style to disguise his identity. Regardless of its authorship, the letter has become the most frequently cited document from the archive, reproduced in articles and discussions about Pierce's work, and it has contributed to the enduring fascination with the case. In the years since the graduate students' research brought Pierce's story to light, there have been occasional attempts to investigate the farmhouse more thoroughly, using modern equipment and methodologies. In 1992, a team of paranormal researchers from Boston spent 3 nights at the property, recording audio and video and conducting what they described as environmental monitoring. They reported several anomalies, including unexplained temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic field variations, and audio recordings that appeared to contain voices, though the voices were too distorted to be understood. The team's report, published in a paranormal research journal, suggested that the property exhibited signs of what they termed residual haunting, a phenomenon in which traumatic events leave an imprint on a location that can be detected under certain conditions. Skeptics pointed out that the farmhouse was old, poorly maintained, and surrounded by dense forest, all of which could easily account for the reported anomalies without invoking paranormal explanations. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker attempted to produce a film about Pierce's work, conducting interviews with local historians, reviewing the archived materials, and filming footage of the farmhouse and the surrounding area. The project was abandoned before completion, reportedly due to difficulties securing funding, though rumors persisted that members of the film crew had experienced unsettling incidents during the shoot, including equipment malfunctions and psychological distress. The unfinished footage has never been released publicly. The story of Dr. Alden Pierce and his attempt to prove the persistence of the human soul after death remains, For those who know of it, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, the ethical boundaries of scientific inquiry, and the profound psychological impact of confronting questions that may be better left unanswered. It is also a story about isolation, about what happens when individuals are removed from the structures and communities that provide meaning and accountability, and placed in situations where their vulnerabilities can be exploited in the name of knowledge. Peirce believed he was advancing human understanding, that he was on the verge of a discovery that would fundamentally alter our conception of existence. But what he actually created was suffering, confusion, and a legacy of trauma that extended far beyond the walls of his barn. The participants in his study paid the price for his ambition, and whether any meaningful knowledge was gained in exchange for that price is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that the boundary Peirce claimed to have discovered, if it exists at all, is not a place that human beings are meant to explore while still living. And those who approach it too closely risk losing not just their lives, but their sense of self, their connection to reality, and their ability to exist peacefully in the world they leave behind. The farmhouse stands today as it has stood for decades, a decaying monument to a question that should perhaps never have been asked. The forest continues to encroach upon it. The roof continues to sag. The windows remain shattered and dark. Inside, the rooms are empty, the walls are stained, the floors are rotting. And in the clearing where the barn once stood, where Dr. Alden Peirce conducted his sessions and brought 5 individuals to the edge of the boundary between life and death, there is nothing now but grass and weeds and the faint circular impression of the foundation, barely visible unless you know to look for it. The site is unmarked. There is no historical plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that anything of significance occurred there. The county has no plans to demolish the farmhouse or develop the property. It will remain as it is, slowly dissolving back into the landscape until eventually there will be no trace that it ever existed. But the question Peirce tried to answer, the question of what happens to consciousness when the body dies, will remain. It is a question that every person must confront eventually, whether through faith, philosophy, or direct experience. And for those who knew Peirce's story, for those who read his notes and listened to the recordings and spoke with the survivors, the question carries an additional weight, a shadow of doubt and fear. Because if Peirce was right, if the boundary is real and consciousness does persist, then perhaps the figures Eleanor Finch saw in the corners of the barn are still there. Perhaps Thomas Hewitt and Daniel Croft and Robert Marsh and Catherine Lyle are still there, trapped in that liminal space, waiting for something, watching for something, unable to move forward and unable to return. And perhaps Dr. Alden Peirce himself, wherever he ended up after 1955, eventually found his way back to the boundary he had spent so much of his life trying to reach. Perhaps he crossed it completely. Perhaps he discovered the truth he had been seeking, or perhaps he learned, too late, that some doors are not meant to be opened, and that the price of knowledge can be the loss of everything that makes existence bearable. The last recorded sighting of anyone resembling Alden Peirce occurred in 1967, in a small village in the Austrian Alps. A visiting American professor of psychology, attending a conference in Vienna, stopped at a rural inn and encountered an elderly man who spoke fluent English with an American accent. The professor later recalled that the man had been thin, almost gaunt, with pale eyes and a distant expression. They spoke briefly about the professor's work, and the conversation turned to the nature of consciousness and memory. The elderly man mentioned that he had once conducted research on similar topics many years ago, but that he had been forced to abandon it due to circumstances beyond his control. When the professor asked what kind of research, the man smiled faintly and said, "I tried to prove that we do not end when the body ends, and I succeeded, but the proof was so terrible that I destroyed it." Because I realized that some truths are not meant to be known. The professor asked the man's name, but the man declined to give it, saying only that he had left his old name behind long ago, along with everything else from his former life. The professor later attempted to locate the inn and the man again, but he could not find the village where he believed the encounter had occurred, and he eventually concluded that he had misremembered the location or that the village had been too small to appear on maps. Whether the elderly man was actually Alden Pierce or simply someone who resembled him and shared a passing interest in consciousness research cannot be determined, but the encounter has become part of the legend surrounding Pierce. One more unverified detail in a story, composed largely of fragments and gaps. What remains certain is that in 1953 and 1954, in a barn on a property on Route 47 in Grafton County, New Hampshire, a series of events occurred that left lasting scars on everyone involved. A scientist pursued a question with relentless determination, using methods that disregarded the well-being of his participants and the ethical standards of his profession. 5 individuals agreed to help him, motivated by financial need and perhaps by curiosity, and they were subjected to experiences that fundamentally altered their lives. Some of them died shortly afterward, some of them disappeared. One of them survived to tell a partial story, but even she could not fully articulate what had happened or what it meant. And the scientist himself, the man who orchestrated it all, vanished from history, leaving behind only his notes, his recordings, and the ruins of the place where he had conducted his work. The question he tried to answer remains unanswered, or at least unproven, but the damage he caused is documented and undeniable, and the warning implicit in his story is clear. There are boundaries that should not be crossed, questions that should not be pursued, and knowledge that comes at too high a cost. Dr. Alden Pierce believed he could prove the soul persists after death. What he actually proved was that human ambition, unchecked by ethics or compassion, can destroy lives in the pursuit of answers that may not exist, or that if they do exist, are too terrible to bear.